Hi everyone, just let us get organised and we will start we'll let people join us too. We'll start. Hi Steve.
Hey Shona, hi everyone.
Steve and I were just in a practice session. We went to start the meeting and I think I don't know what happened. I got kicked off. I had to rejoin, but we're here.
I'm going to panic.
Momentary panic, yes, but we're here. Hi everyone, thanks for joining us. We're going to give it a minute or two just while people join us. I can see you all coming along, which is great. And thanks so much for joining us this afternoon. Oh, thanks, Peter. I had to re-register to get in for some reason. That's a shame. Hopefully people haven't had too many problems either. All right. Okay. We'll just give it another minute or so because there still seems to be a lot of people joining us, but welcome to those people who are joining us now. And we'll properly introduce ourselves as well in a moment, or I will, and I'll introduce Steve. All right, I think we might get going just to acknowledge the people who come on time and get going. So thanks so much for joining us all this afternoon. My name is Shona Witten. I'm the National Lead for Recovery and Psychosocial Support at Australian Red Cross in our emergency operations team. We've been doing this sort of series of webinars over the last couple of months in response to the flood events that have occurred in Queensland and northern New South Wales, and also around Sydney in the Greater Sydney area. And we did a similar series after the 2019-20 bushfires as well, and Steve joined us for one of those. Steve is a friend of ours at Red Cross. He has over 30 years experience in disaster management, and in particular what he's here to talk to you about is his experiences after Black Saturday. So in 2009, Steve's from Strathure in Victoria, and his community and his own property were devastated by the fires. And Steve was heavily involved in Strathure's recovery as one of the community leaders that established the Strathure Community Renewal Association, and was chair of the recovery committee, or deputy chair, I think, Steve, for 2 years. So he's supported other communities as well in their recovery after disasters. In particular, he's mentored community leaders from Malakuta in Victoria after their bushfire experience in New Year's Eve 2019. And is involved in their community-led recovery process, which you can watch all about on ABC documentary at the moment. Plug for that. And Steve's been really heavily involved in working with us to provide advice and mentoring to other communities and recovery practitioners. So he's definitely an expert in disasters and disaster recovery, and has been really important in helping us at Red Cross support an initiative called the Disaster Advisors and Mentors Australia concept, and he's a member of the steering committee, and we support that as well at Red Cross. So I'm no doubt he'll talk a little bit about that this morning. Before I hand over to Steve, just a couple of kind of housekeeping things. Today all kind of runs smoothly. We're recording this session just to make you aware of that. You can view the recording on our YouTube channel. It takes us about a week or so to get them up there, just internal admin stuff, but it is on a YouTube channel called Red Cross Disaster Recovery YouTube something, and also there's a link through to that on our disaster recovery webinars page on our website. So that's where you can find this. You can also find recordings of the session we did with Dr. Rob Gordon last week, and also on our website there is details of an upcoming webinar we've got after this with Jolie Wills, who is from New Zealand, and she's going to run a webinar on recovery after large-scale disasters. She was very involved in the recovery in Christchurch as both a survivor and a recovery worker. That's on the 12th of May, maybe the 10th of May. And all the details are on our website for that. Steve will also he's got some slides. He'll make those available to you all. So don't feel like you madly have to take notes. He's going to share some pearls of wisdom, but we will send those to you tomorrow in a follow-up email. And he'll have some links and things like that in there as well for further information. How we're going to run the session today, we've got about an hour and a half. Steve is going to present for about the first half, and then we'll take a break for questions. We'd invite you to put questions or comments in the chat and the Q&A function throughout the session, and I will pose those questions to Steve halfway through when we take a bit of a break for, a breather. Do you want to get a cup of tea or anything like that? But we'll also look at the questions in the middle, and then Steve will finish his presentation, and if we've got time, we'll revisit some other questions at the end. If you wish during the questions to put your hand up, I can take you off mute if you've got a kind of something you'd like to discuss a bit more in detail rather than typing out a question. We can do that too. But I think that's everything I had to address. Steve, anything I've missed before I hand over?
All good.
Good to go. Okay, I will let you share your screen. I'll take my video off, so you'll just be looking at Steve and hearing his slides as well. Over to you, Steve.
Thanks, Shona. Hi, everyone. As Shona said, I did one of these a couple of years ago and spoke for an hour and a half, which was a bit hard on everyone. So this time I put in some slides, so you're not just looking at me the whole time. And yes, no, all right. I'll open that up again and put that away. And now I'll share that. Okie dokie, and I'll make it big.
Great, can see them.
Okay, terrific. Everyone okay with that?
Good.
Are you able to just take yourself off video there, Shona, or is that just going to stay there, the Red Cross recovery box? Not to matter. Push on. So thanks for having me along. As Shona said, I've been involved in a fair bit of professionally in disaster planning and response and recovery. And I also have some fairly significant personal experience. So I'll just kick off and we'll see how we go. So talking about community-led recovery, and obviously I've got a bit of passion and bias toward it, so I think it's the best model and I've not seen anything that's better. So why is community-led recovery the best? Local communities understand disaster impacts and needs better than anyone. They know their stuff. They know their strengths, weaknesses and vulnerabilities. They know who needs help. They know where they live. They know who's doing well, all those things. And this can, all that stuff changes day to day. So working in communities, they just know stuff. They know their history and aspire to a future. So they know what's happened before, and often that really provides a context for community recovery. If you don't know it, you miss out on a whole bunch of things. And communities also aspire to a future. So there's a huge amount of energy and passion which will drive their desire for their own recovery. They're invested in themselves, so it's not a matter of dollars or cents. They will do a huge amount of work for themselves and to make their communities better, and that's an enormous asset. There are amazing skills and resources within communities, and that's often untapped or ignored, or worse still, just disrespected in recovery efforts I've seen led by government. And one of the things I realised that communities are there for a long time before and long times after agency staff and governments have left the scene. So again, they're really invested in their stuff. Agency staff change all the time, communities tend to not. Another reason why community-led recovery is best is that it strengthens communities, and this is something that's very much part of disaster recovery or disaster management at the moment, is about resilience. So if communities lead their own recovery, build a resilience rather than dependence. And dependence is a real something that I think has evolved over a number after the last 5 or 6 decades. We've become very dependent on government fixing our stuff. Another reason why community-led recovery is best, that it strengthens community by building skills, strength, capacity in community. My own community of Strathure is a very different community than it was before the fires of 2009. We have exceptional leaders, we've got great networks, everyone works together. A lot of the old animosities and challenges disappeared in the fire. We had to work together, and we're better because of that. It's optimally efficient. It's based on community-led recovery is based on needs. It's timely. It's cost-effective. So if if it's just a fiscal argument or an efficiency argument, community-led recovery is still best. It engages agencies and community. When I started playing in community-led recovery, I thought that's okay. We just need to retool governments and their community engagement teams to engage communities. After a while, I realised that that was actually a mistake. It was self-limiting, and turned it around, changed the paradigm so that we actually engage agencies in communities. And that works brilliantly well for everyone. It's great for communities to build their strengths and resilience, all that sort of stuff. It's also great for agencies and organisations who don't need to take on so much, and a lot of their work is done for them, and they know that they're supporting a process that is best. So community-centred rather than government-centred. How does community-led planning process work best? It's really important that it's representative, inclusive and collaborative. So it's very much a democratic model, I guess. We're all challenged a bit by democracy at the moment. Open and transparent. It's critically important that communities who are participating, the members of communities, trust and respect the process. And for that to happen, it needs to be completely open, needs to be highly inclusive, needs to be completely transparent. And that's right down to the details. So minutes of meetings and financial accounts and all those sort of things need to be really open and transparent. Collaborative, based on strengths, skills and resources. Often we don't collaborate well. It's been one of my desires, challenges for years, and I'm also involved in land care. And we have different organisations doing different things in our land, but also in disaster recovery. In terms of community recovery, there's community organisations, there are local governments, there's state governments, and there's federal governments, and there's a whole lot of agencies and organisations outside of that. They all have different strengths, they all have different skills, and they all have different resources. To do the best we can, we need to use what everyone has. So at a community level, really good at engaging people and describing what the needs are, understanding about knowing what the vulnerabilities are, all that sort of stuff. Governments, particularly as you get further away from the community, less good at that. But governments are terrific at logistics, at organising things, and finding funding and coordinating funding, of coordinating support. So if we bring that all together, if we combine the strengths of communities with the strengths and resources of governments, we get a much better outcome, much more efficient, much more targeted to the needs. And that's often something that we miss, even in recent disaster recovery community-led processes that I've been involved in. Often collaboration is difficult or non-existent. So that's something that needs to be worked on. Community-led planning needs to be advocates, and that's one of the challenges. How do you find these people? And that's a bit of a story in itself. I think we were fortunate in Strathure that we were able to kick off with respected and trusted community leaders, and that carried us through very well. I know other communities back in 2009 where people stepped forward and proposed themselves or pushed themselves into the position of leadership, but they weren't actually leading their community. They weren't respected or trusted. Some of them weren't even of the community. They just stepped in and started doing things. And initially that's not, that's okay. You can get away with it for a while, but after a while it turns very sour, very destructive, and not much good comes out of it. So it's really important that it be led by respected and trusted community leaders. And that will be identified by communities, generally not by governments. An extensive and inclusive process of local engagement and participation. It's really important that all members of an affected community feel that they are part of the process, that they have capacity to contribute as and when they can, that they're consulted, that they are part of the decision-making process, they contribute to the decision-making process. One of the moments, one of the best things we did in Strathure and with our community-led recovery process was making it inclusive. We started out fairly early on by trying to decide what our community was, what the community of Strathure is, what's the line on the map. We started thinking about drawing a line on the map, and it's Strathure, and it's not Strathure. But we realised that disadvantaged a whole bunch of people. We had people from around Victoria who had loved ones who died in Strathure, people who owned property in Strathure. We had someone die in Strathure in the bushfires whose family was from South Africa. So we had to include all of those in our recovery process and thoughts. So rather than trying to define what was or who was Strathure, we turned it around and said that if you believe that you are part of Strathure, if you have an interest in Strathure, if you consider yourself to be a Strathure person, then you are. So we didn't put a boundary around our community. If whoever wanted to be involved could be, and that continues to this day. There's a whole bunch of people around Australia who consider themselves Strathure people. One of the challenges is how does the community make decisions? And I've seen many processes where wants are prioritised rather than needs. And often wants are, it's often, I see, we want a swimming pool, or we want a new hall, or we want bike paths, or we want a barbecue and a rotunda, or often the wants aren't terribly tied to what the needs are in recovery and of a community. The needs will be around the basics of life: food, water, shelter, getting together, socialising, recovery of the natural environment, restoring built environment, and looking after the economics, the needs of business within the affected communities. So having a needs-based process and trying to not get dragged into the wants is really important. Talk a bit about Strathure and then talk a little bit about my experience in Malakuta. So Strathure, Black Saturday 2009, 7th of February 2009. The entire district of Strathure and surrounds was devastated by a very, very dramatic and huge bushfire. In that, this is a photo I got sent to me afterwards, and I thought it was a black and white photo, but in actual fact, it's a colour photo, and you can't see much colour. Right at the top of the valley, hidden in there somewhere, is a little patch of green. My house is right in the middle of that photo. 80 out of our 100 houses were destroyed. So we figured there was about 100 residential properties in the Strathure district. It's a small rural hamlet, I guess, 50 kilometres to the northeast of Melbourne, surrounded by National Park pretty much. Agricultural, horticultural, but mostly lifestylers. Tragically, 29 people died. We have a population of, at that time, a bit over 200. So it was a huge impact on our community. Some of those people were visitors, but many of them were our community leaders and who had, for one reason or other, ended up within the fire and perished as a result. Horrifying for their families, horrifying for their loved ones, and pretty tragic for our community. We had to learn to deal with that. Yeah, enough said. Really early on, we established a community-led recovery. We thought that was important. It resulted in us forming an incorporated association. We had a formally elected committee for that association. So rather than hands up who wants to be on the committee, it was a very formal process run on Victorian Electoral Commission guidelines. And we used the 4 community recovery environments, or 4 community environments, they're not just about recovery, which were the best thing we had in disaster recovery planning at that stage in 2009. So that's based around social, natural, economic and built environments. It was really handy to have a framework or some sort of structure to do our planning on. So social environment was around, was our highest priority, about getting people together again and looking after ourselves and our well-being. Natural environment was completely devastated, and it was we love living where we do, so it was a really important thing. The built environment, obviously, we'd lost all our houses, and infrastructure, every piece of infrastructure, community infrastructure was gone. So we had to rethink that. And the opportunity to do it better, to do things, we had a clean slate, so let's do things better. Economic we thought about it for a while, and as it turned out, it was not such a big thing in Strathure, and so we didn't do much around business economy. So early planning, the small, within a week of the fires happening, one of our community leaders that was just outside the fire area got a group of us together, so 4 or 5 people, and started saying, well, let's start thinking about how we'll lead our own recovery. Because if we wait for someone else to do it for us, it'll be too late and it'll probably be the wrong thing. So we really got on the front foot with that. We talked about it for a while and realised that we, as 4 or 5 individuals, had no authority or reason to be setting ourselves up as the deciders and the thinkers of the Strathure community. We realised that we actually needed to establish an organisation that was chosen by our community so that it had the respect and trust that it needed to do its job. We also were starting to receive funds. Someone had an actual real novelty check for $100,000, which was backed by money in the bank. And it was sitting in the back of their wardrobe for a number of months. We didn't know what to do with it. So we needed to be able to manage money as well. To do that, we needed a legal entity. So we proposed that we establish an incorporated community association that would give us the capacity to open a bank account, to have to elect a committee, to have legal protections, and a whole range of other benefits. It was also by having a community association, it made it easier for government to interact with us and talk with us. So we proposed to the community that this association be formed. We named it the Strathure Community Renewal Association. So rather than just recovery, which is a bit jargonistic, renewal seemed to be the best word we could come up with, because our whole town, our district needed to be restarted, redone, and we could do it better and we could do it new. And we formed an association. We had a 12-person committee, which was formally elected, as I said. We set ourselves up what's the word? A constitution, that's the one. And in that, we established a sunset clause of 3 years, that we would be a recovery group, a recovery association for 3 years, with the opportunity to revisit the purposes of the association at the end of those 3 years, and with the opportunity that, perhaps we became the Strathure Progress Association or something else, or social group or something. We felt that 3 years was about right. Obviously, it was going to be more than 1 year. 2 years is probably a bit short. 3 years was good. Ultimately, it ran for 5 years, and my own observations were that was about 1 year too long. We did a lot of the planning and a lot of the work in 3 years. 4th year was about finalising things, finishing off projects, quitting monies, wrapping things up. And the 5th year was just dragged on a little bit long, and was more about some people involved in the process wanting to hang on to things. As I said, we planned we based our planning on 4 community environments, which was really very useful. And we set up working groups. We established projects under that based on needs, and we established working groups for each project. And that might have only been 2 people, but it meant that we could devolve responsibility. So the 12 people on the committee weren't doing everything. One of us would be on each of the working groups as chair or contributor, and bringing that back to the main committee. And that meant that people in our community who didn't want to be on a committee, but who wanted to participate or to take some action, could be on a working group, or to lead a working group, or to propose a project and carry it that way. Within the formation of our committee had 12 elected community representatives, but we also included council representatives and agency representatives as ex officio members. They were on our committee. They would come to all meetings. They didn't have voting rights, not that we voted very often. I don't think we voted ever. And that was just extraordinarily good support. Again, our community has strengths and knowledge and resources, but there's bunches of things that we aren't good at. I can remember early on we established a temporary relief centre, which was someone's house they were building. It had roofs and walls, but no internals and no electricity, no heating. There's no way as a community we were going to be able to set that up. We spoke to our council and they said, we'll organise it. And within a matter of weeks, the power was on, there was phone lines, there was heating, there was chairs and tables, photocopiers, access to computers, and all the things that we needed to get ourselves going. And that was really easy for, well, I think in observations it was really easy. For our local council to do that, they're really good at that stuff. Most of them they had sitting around in a hall somewhere or in their offices. And that was just extraordinary. Also, having them sitting at the table with us meant that they just stepped in and say, we can organise that, we'll fix that for you. And that was just brilliant. So that's about that the value of collaboration again. After the fires in Malakoota, I'd been doing some work with some community leaders in Malakoota in 2019, working on community-based bushfire fuel management planning, how they could, as a community, contribute to make decisions and influence the way bushfire prevention was done around their town, focus more on the town rather than on the forest. So I spent a good deal of 2019 driving backwards and forwards to Malakoota and building relationships and facilitating and supporting that process. In New Year's Eve 2019, fire started to the north-west of Malakoota, and over the next 24 hours became a bit of an inferno and burnt into and through Malakoota. 140 houses were lost. The abalone factory, which is the biggest employer and the biggest business infrastructure in the town, was destroyed. However, the town centre survived, so that was a great bonus and very important for the recovery of the community. Eventually, they established a community-led recovery process. They formed a recovery association and elected a formal committee. Shortly after the fire, I had made some phone calls to the community leaders I've been working with on the fire prevention, and said to them, if I can help, let me know, and I'll be there as soon as I can. Within 2 weeks, or 2 weeks after the fires, I was able to be flown into Malakoota, courtesy of Red Cross and the RAF. The roads were completely blocked for a month, I think maybe 6 weeks even. So there was no other way of getting in or out. So I was very privileged to be able to be flown in. So I started working with this little group of community leaders who I'd been working with, and we again realised that they couldn't make decisions, that they couldn't direct traffic, they couldn't do anything without the permission and support of the whole community. We couldn't call them a planning group because they had no authority to plan. Instead, we called them the thinking group, and no one could question that. And while they're just thinking, they made no decisions. They were very good at just developing stuff and proposing it. I was there for 3 days or 4 days in the first instance, had a meeting with this little group about an hour after I arrived on the plane. And by the end of the time I was down there, the group had contacted all the community organisations within Malakoota, which there's about 40, and invited the leaders of those groups, whether that be the president or the chair or the convener or whatever, to come to a small meeting to discuss what we thought might help. Of 40 organisations, we kind of expected 15 people to turn up, but we had 60 people from different organisations turn up to a meeting in a small building, which was very full, but that's a good way of running a meeting. So we proposed to this group of 60 community leaders that our thoughts and what some ideas were, and asked if they thought it was a good idea. And if it was a good idea, we'd keep going, but if they thought it wasn't a good idea, then we'd pack up and I'd go home and they would get on with what they wanted to. Malakoota is quite a difficult community, very layered. lots of different history. Yeah, watch the People's Republic of Malakuta on iView, and you'll get to understand what that's about. With the permission of the representatives, the 60 representatives, we kept going and developed a concept of community-led recovery. We then took it back to those same leaders of organisations and said, this is what we're thinking, this is what we've come up with, this is kind of how it would work, this is what it would mean. What do you reckon? And again, if you think this is a good idea, we can keep going. If you don't think it's a good idea, we'll scrap it and we'll go to plan B, which we had no idea what that was. Of the 60, I think there was 2 dissenters, but by far the majority were, yep, that's terrific, let's keep going. So as a thinking group, we developed up the structures, the process, the proposals, how it would work, the idea of an association, the idea of a committee. And before anything further happened, we took it to a community meeting. Again, Malakuta has a permanent population of something over 1,000 people. Half of those had left, or more than half. Yeah, no, half of those had left. Some had returned. We proposed a community meeting on a night at the golf club, based on everyone else's experience of community things. We kind of expected out of maybe 100 people to turn up. It was incredibly well publicised. It was members of the thinking group sat in the main street by the post office and handed out pieces of paper about how it worked and what it was. Phone calls were made. It was put in the local newsletter. And we had over 500 people respond and come to the meeting at the golf club, which is the picture there. The purpose of the meeting, the community meeting, was to propose the formation of a community association and to ask for membership of that. So all people, there was some conditions around who could be members, and basically that was about people who were resident or had businesses in Malakuta at the time of the fires. We had form letters for people to fill out and seek membership of the association. And we had those in boxes on tables for people once we'd finished the proposal and the presentation, that they would then pick up a bit of paper and sign it, and fill it out when they got home and put it in an envelope and send it back. The publicity and the desire was so great that people were walking into the golf club, picking up bits of paper, filling it in, signing it and dropping it in the boxes before the meeting. So it was very well received, and people were looking for an opportunity for the whole community to work together to recover themselves. Nominations were sought for a committee. That was a bit challenging. People kept asking, so what happens if the wrong people get on the committee? I kept saying, it'll be okay. Your community knows who the good people are. They know who the ratbags are, and they will pick good people to represent them and to lead their stuff, and ultimately they did. 40 people nominated. The election process was actually run by the Victorian Electoral Commission. Thank them very much. Huge task, and a huge task for the community to actually work through that. They ultimately elected a committee of 12 good people, and just so extraordinary, age range from 70 to 22, and half male and half female. So it was just the best democratic process, or best outcome of a democratic process I've seen for a long time. The committee got going and started talking about, again, their purposes, developed a constitution, all the governance things, and then set about strategic planning, the immediate needs, the medium-term needs and the long-term needs, and how they would set about resolving that. Unfortunately, disaster upon disaster, COVID hit in 2019 and just made their job almost impossible. One of the highest priorities for communities affected by disasters is to get together to hugs and kisses and community meetings and barbecues and to spend a lot of time together. COVID made that virtually impossible. It made it difficult to get resources in and out. It meant it was hard to find builders. It was hard to get agencies to come to meetings. It was all done by Zoom, which is just, it's fine to see me on Zoom right here now. But in terms of building rapport, in terms of building trust and relationships, it's not the best tool. After 2019, I also worked with, mentored a number of other communities and community recovery leaders and practitioners, so people from government and local government, about community-led recovery, essentially. And there's some things I've learned over that time. There's lots of things I've learned over that time. Some of them are that every community is different. There is no one size fits all. We hear that, it's become a bit of a cliche, but I don't know, no one seems to learn it. Every community is different. They're going to have different needs. They'll have different experiences. They'll have different skills and resources. They'll be in different geographic locations. They'll be made up of sub-communities. And their pathway through recovery, their needs, will all be completely different. One of the best pieces of advice I've given to disaster affected communities and practitioners is that everyone is impacted. Do not enable a league ladder of loss. That do not set them up. Do not say, "Oh, you've lost houses, so you're worse off than everyone else." In our community, one of our community leaders lost his house, as most of us did, but his greatest loss was his dogs. He couldn't get over that. There are people who don't feel that they qualify, live outside the area, or some of our residents didn't lose their houses. And I think they actually suffered more than we did who did lose houses. So if people who didn't lose their houses suffered a whole bunch of grief, they didn't get any support. There was almost no help in terms of grants or counselling or other stuff. Don't use the word counselling, Steve. They had to live in a horrendous landscape for years, black, burnt, horribly dusty over summer, stinking and muddy over winter, just a terrible thing. So I feel, really sorry for people who don't lose houses. It's a hard slog. Loss is loss. There's no, like I said, there's no league ladder of loss. It's everyone's loss is their own, and there's no way that anyone has the right to value that in any way. And again, just being open to that idea of loss is loss. You don't, everyone's the same. We all are impacted, and that's really, really important to understand. I've learnt from Dr. Rob. Dr. Rob, I've worked with Dr. Rob for many years, listened to him, love listening to him. And at the time of our fires, or prior to our fires, I sort of heard him talk about recovery from disasters being about 2 years. I thought that's fair, and sort of towards the end of 2 years, I thought I must be better now, I must be over it, I must be recovered. And Dr. Rob came and talked to our community and said, well, I'm now thinking that recovery takes about 6 years. And I said, "Oh, Rob, you said it was 2 years. I thought I was finished." But he was right. So in terms of personal recovery from disasters, Dr. Rob talks about the 6 years, and he describes it as 2 years, and I've reinterpreted, so forgive me, Rob. The way I see it is that the first 2 years is just about stabilising your life. Initially getting clothes to wear, opening your bank accounts, getting your licenses and passports, getting all the stuff that you lost in the fire or whatever. Stabilising your life, getting somewhere to live, getting comfortable about that, reconnecting with family and community, all those sort of things. So the first 2 years, I think, is about stabilising your life, stopping it being chaotic, stopping it being traumatic. The next 2 years is, so years 3 and 4, is very much about re-establishing or establishing your new life, because the life you had is gone. There's still stuff that you have, but a lot of it is changed. A life-changing event used to change your life, and I don't know too many people who haven't gone through some sort of process of becoming different people as a result of the impact of a very significant disaster. And Dr. Rob talks about the next 2 years, years 5 and 6, about getting over the previous 4 years. It's hugely energy sapping, draining. It's hard work. I look back over the first 12 months after the fires, and I can't believe what I personally did. It was just amazing how I did it. I have no idea. Adrenaline's wonderful and terrible at the same time. My own sense of my own recovery, I felt that I stopped being a fire person at about 7.5 years. I started thinking about holidays and work and gardening and having enjoyment and having fun and all those things. I had space to do that. I had energy to do that. I didn't feel guilty about enjoying myself. So I think for people, it takes up to 10 years to recover, to restore themselves from the results of a big disaster. From a community's perspective, I think it's about 10 years for the community to be back to be in a place that they value, to be efficient and effective. We had a 10-year anniversary, and we knew that was going to be a big thing. We talked to Dr. Rob about what the significance of that was, and he described it as being a marker in time, that we would place the events of the previous 10 years into our history, and we could look forward to our future. It was just almost a watershed. And so we had a very large gathering, our 10-year anniversary, and that seems to be what happened, that all of us there, we had stories and insights. And following that event, we seemed to be a much happier and a much more stable and forward-looking community. As I said, recovery leadership at a local level, I think needs to be around 3 to 4 years. You need to be aiming for that as you're establishing that. Longer is unhelpful, shorter is inefficient. So as Shona said, we'll take a bit of a break and we'll do some questions and answers, questions and observations. So feel free to put anything on the chat and questions. Shona will go through those and post some of them back to me, and I'll talk about them. After the break, I've got some more information. So why do we find community-led recovery difficult? Establishing community leadership, one of the challenges, planning and managing recovery, some advice for community leaders, and some advice for helping organisations. And at the end, I've got a page of useful sources of information, which is just the things I can think of off the top of my head, but there'll be many others. So feel free to wander off and grab a cuppa, take a loo break, do come back, and Shona, if you want to butt back in, we can do some questions and chat.
Hi, Steve. I will. I won't turn my camera on because I think people are more interested in hearing from you. We've got one question at the moment that's been sitting here for a little while, and it's a great one. I'm not sure who's, they didn't put their name in, so apologies about that, but it says, when we talk about communities, is there a particular sized community unit in mind? For example, the Lismore local government area is vastly different in size, around 30,000 people, to somewhere like Korakai, around 1,500.
Yep.
Who defines the community? I think you did touch on that a little bit, but you just want to speak to that, and we've just got another one here in the comments as well.
It's certainly a challenge. I think community-led recovery works. It's very easy at small communities such as Strathure. Worked well in Malakuta. I think it works up to populations of 3,000 to 5,000 is pretty easy to do because they have existing organisations, lots of networks. I think very challenging for those very large communities or towns. Perhaps, and also quite difficult in urban environments, I think. And perhaps the way to deal with it there is working through community organisations rather than trying to establish anything new or different. But and another approach is perhaps establishing district communities or communities of interest or something like that, and having that as a representative, having representatives from that come to a central community recovery committee. So yes, very large communities, very large towns, I guess. And we shouldn't just think of communities as being geographic based. It's not, it may not be the community of Lismore. It could be, I imagine Lismore has self-identified smaller areas within it. And communities will self-identify, they'll know which bit they belong to. So there's opportunities there as well. But that doesn't stop agencies, government thinking about how they promote and how they engage community-led recovery.
Yeah, I think you make a good point about bigger communities because, you know, they're not homogenous, right? I mean, it can be, you can sort of, oh, we're all in this local government area. Sometimes you sort of, well, everything's going to have, everyone's going to have sort of the same impact or the same needs, and that's not the case. And there are, as you make a good point, really different communities of interest, and communities do self-identify. So,
yes, and that's self-identification. I've worked in communities where how do we define this community, and people will know, they'll be on different sides of the road. They belong to one geographic community, and the other people on the other side will belong to another one, or they're commuters, so they will have association with a different place.
Well, sometimes different states, which we've seen a bit down around the Malakuta area, you know, people go into New South Wales for some services and stay in Victoria for others, and that's an issue, a similar situation in the Northern Rivers as well. Using
a local government area is easy, but it may not be the best.
We've got another question here from Ruth. With wild weather events predicted to be more frequent, more intense and wider spread, we are in for a tough time. Will we still be dealing with loss and recovery from previous events when the next one hits? Comments rather than question, really, she's asked.
I think that's become proven. When I was doing disaster emergency management, I've been doing it for 30 years. 20 years ago, I was going, major disasters happen about every 40 years, significant ones every 20 years, and regular bad things happen every 10 years. And that's just shifted. And I think we have catastrophes at least every 5 years. And in the last little while, there's been multiples every year. It's a growing business. I'm not sure whether I'm glad to be retired or not.
Well, I mean, I can certainly agree and say that, you know, my work the last 2 years have been very hectic, and I think other people that work in emergency management and community services that are disaster or kind of recovery facing certainly feel that the new the new normal, I suppose, is cumulative impacts of disasters and really thinking about what that's going to look like going forward. So yes, I think, Ruth, we will be, is probably the short answer to that. What that means for all of the things that we know now about recovery and disasters, I think still we're still kind of trying to work our way through. Anyway, more questions, Steve, so I better crack on with my job here.
I just realised the time, so I'll crack on as well.
Yeah. Andrew has said, thanks for some great insights, Steve. One of the immediate challenges we've identified is mental health, particularly given ongoing challenges and traumas, so COVID, recurring floods, etc. We've had a particularly stoic community who are reluctant to seek help. Would love to hear your experience with this kind of work and supporting people and their mental health.
Yeah, tread carefully, but sensibly. People within such communities, farming communities in particular, outreach is really valuable. Just going and knocking on doors and say, how you doing, blah, 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 blah. Really difficult in COVID times, tragically bad in COVID times. And the stories are that you'll go to someone's house and say, how are you doing? And oh, no, we're fine, we're okay. But you need to go now to talk to Fred next door because he's just not doing well. And you go next door to Fred and you go, oh, no, I'm good. But that guy over there he's losing it. So again, community-based, people know each other and they know what's going on. So working in communities, working to support them and providing tools for them to help rather than trying to own everything and do everything to them, working with them is the way to go.
Yeah, I think also another one on that in my experience is, or what I've heard from many other communities is that, we see often in the early phases a lot of talk about mental health impact and services that are available early. But what we see is that some people, like the types of people that you described, Steve, it really takes time for them to feel to be ready to access support. Yes. And we really need to make sure that support is available, in the months and years ahead, because often for these kind of more stoic people, they hold it together and then it's 2 or 3 years down the line that then they're really ready, and often the support's no longer there because of funding or whatever.
I was going to say something else pithy, but I can't remember. Being within your own community is a really great medicine for mental health. And again, that's a good reason for community-led recovery, just being together. I said, Steve, don't say counselling. Counselling contraindicated in early days. I learnt that to my detriment there was counselling being offered at the local community health centre, and I thought, well, okay, I'll bundle my family, my wife and 2 young 20-year-olds off to do counselling, just to see how we are and get a bit of a benchmark. It was one of the worst experiences I've ever been to. It was just bad, and kicked myself every day not every day, for doing that. And I don't think it didn't help us at all, and probably did some damage. So being with our community was the best thing.
Oh, great. That was a question, actually. So you've prompted someone's question, which is great. Couple more things here. Sorry, Bernadine, we're just doing some questions while people were grabbing a cup of tea if they wanted one. So probably 2 more questions and then we'll crack on, Steve, and let you finish up. So one here from Joe. Thanks, Steve. Much useful reflection here. You've talked about the difficulties the pandemic poses for the key work of communities getting together. Given we're still in the midst of the pandemic, what have you learned about ways to connect?
I've been very grateful that I've not been involved in disaster operations in the last 2 years, apart from mentoring folk. I'm not sure I have any great observations on how to manage the COVID thing. I guess the only working around it a bit and having driveway get-togethers, and using, working within the rules, but at least being able to see people and talk with people is, and I guess Zooming has become a thing. I used to hate video conferences. Now it's just the thing. So no, I think the restrictions of COVID has just been a tragedy in terms of community building and all those things. It will end and we will learn stuff and we'll get through it. That's not helped a lot of people.
An easy one here from Nerida. Who is Dr. Rob? And would he be suitable to support Lismore and the wider community? So Dr. Rob, excuse us for using the shorthand, those of us that worked with him. He's a trauma psychologist, a clinical psychologist that has worked in disaster recovery for quite some time, the last 30 or 40 years or so. So it's Dr. Rob Gordon. He did a webinar for us 2 weeks ago that you can view the recording of. I'll drop the link into the chat in a moment. And so Rob will be doing some stuff. He consults to Red Cross and also to some state governments. And, you know, he's not as able to travel so much anymore, but we're doing a fair few online things with him to kind of ensure that we can get Rob's very, very valuable support out there into the community. But happy, Nerida, for you to drop me a line if you want to talk more about that. And Nerida's put in another question about young people who have lost schools and all their support services, sporting facilities. We don't have a youth group or hub, and Headspace lost their premises, as have many other services and NGOs. Any ideas for supporting young people when there is nothing left?
Yeah, one of the really difficult things I know in Strathure, we're old people. So we sort of got about the setting, you know, adult challenges and problems and community challenges and problems. And we didn't have a lot of young people, but we didn't do much for them. My 24-year-old daughter at that time said, well, it's all very well for you old people. What are you doing for us? I said, we don't know. Get together with your friends and tell us what you need and we'll make it happen. And she said, well, I don't know. So it was a bit of a get out of jail for me. The best solution, the best action I've seen is in Mallacoota. They established a youth centre. I hate to call it that, but it was a place that was set up by them, led by a wonderful young local woman who struggled. No, you know, she was working full time on getting this together, and she couldn't get someone to help her out to give her some living costs. Or it was one of the things that drives me to know that we need to do recovery better. We need to do it quicker. We need to meet the needs, not the bureaucratic needs, the needs of affected communities. You might be able to find that on if you search Mallacoota youth something or other, forget what it's called now.
Yeah, it had a great name, like the Sanctuary.
That's it.
Right.
There was a vacant shop, and they rented the vacant shop. Someone rented the vacant shop for them, and I don't know that it's still going, but it was certainly going for a long time, and they did wonderful, wonderful stuff. So check that out.
Yeah. All right, Steve, we might. We've got one or two other questions, but we might just park those if we've got time at the end, and I'll let you kind of crack on, and I will put myself back on mute.
And I will talk faster because I thought I was going to finish way too early, and so I filled in a bit. So I will go faster. Why do we find community-led recovery difficult? And it's only occurred to me in the last few years that this is actually a challenge. And this is an opportunity for my soapbox. I don't do this for nothing. This is me to chance to mouth off about something. Why do we find community-led recovery difficult? Over a few years, I realised that resilience isn't a problem. Resilience is everything at the moment. You've got to have resilience in your grant application if you're going to get money. It's not a problem, but the dependency is actually a problem. 60 years ago, 100 years ago, every community was resilient. We managed our own stuff. If something happened, people would turn up and fix things. over the last, I reckon it's 60 years, people have become more dependent on government, and government's promoted that. So it works for everyone. Good folk get to be lazy, governments get to be re-elected. Resilience is not a problem, but dependency is. We need to somehow get around that. Societally, we've evolved expectation that governments will fix everything, and sometimes they expect they should be able to fix everything as well, and that's clearly not the case. If we at local level can fix things, we need governments to support us. So we've evolved to expect this, but governments aren't great at meeting the needs of disaster-affected communities. And there's a whole bunch of reasons for that, but some of them are timeframes. They need to have reports, they need to have presentations, they need to go through a committee, they need to go through the executive, blah, blah, blah. So when, early on, the urgent need is for pellets of water or some meals ready to eat, and it takes, we'll get it to you in a month. And it's needed on the first day or the second day, not in a week or 2 weeks. And when it does turn up in 2 weeks or a month, it's no longer needed. It's just a waste of time and a waste of effort. So timeframes are often a challenge for governments meeting the needs. Processes, it's bureaucratic process is just, I've been in governments. I know what it's like. It's all processed, and we don't do that in response activities. We have the fire trucks go out and put fires out. In recovery, we kind of have this long, drawn-out business as usual process, and it has to go through the system, and that's not helpful. There's a whole bunch of bureaucratic drivers that are limiting governments being effective in disaster recovery. So it's much more effective for community to lead, and something that I stumbled over a while ago and coined the phrase, that the support organisations, governments, local government, NGOs, are helpers. And so I've now termed them helping organisations. And if they can get their head around that and go, oh, we're just here to help, that would be a great thing. Establishing community leadership. So there's enormous power in organised communities. And most people don't actually understand that. If communities get themselves organised, they have, I say to people, you actually have access to the Premier if you want to. If you work hard enough, you can go and speak to the Premier. People in local government can't. People in state government can't. They're all limited by that process, but well-organised communities have enormous power. There's value in establishing leadership early. So getting going early, getting something happening allows everyone else to relax. And that's something I saw in Strathure, and not something I saw in Mallacoota. Mallacoota was very quickly heading into dangerous places where multiple leadership groups and people wanting everything, and it would have become a competitive environment. By getting going early, having something going, having trusted leaders talking about stuff, not making decisions, just talking about it, really settled everything, and people knew something was happening, so that was okay. There are good and not so good leaders, and there's probably a whole presentation on that, so I won't spend too much time on that, but being aware of that, particularly if you're in a government organisation, who do I talk to? And that's a real challenge. But they exist. People said, you were lucky in Strathure because you had all these great leaders. I disagree. I think every community has leaders. It's just the way they're treated depends on how well that's going to work out. Transparency and communication. That's what I've talked about with respect to Strathure and Mallacoota. Just being open. You can't do enough of it, and you can do it. If you don't do it, then it goes bad. Can't communicate enough. Newsletters, emails, Facebook pages, whatever. Just getting information out there, letting people know things are happening is gold. It's absolutely critical. You can't do without. In terms of community leadership, I've sort of figured there's a few different models of ways communities can lead themselves, at least get started. Some that I've seen that have been pretty effective has been existing community representative organisations. A few small towns, the hall committee stepped up because it was incorporated, it was fair, there was people, they were often, you know, the people in town who do stuff. And that's a really great model for getting going early. So halls, they open up as relief centres and the committee gets going and they organise this and they see the need, so they get going. Really wonderful in the initial stages, but it can be challenging over the long term because these people who didn't expect to be on a recovery committee, they don't have any knowledge that wasn't their intent. They can do it for some time, but I know that after 2 years, after the 2019-20 fires, those sort of groups who set themselves up and just kept going are really burnt out. And it's not what they signed up for. They signed up to run the hall or the land care group or something else. So it's really hard for them to keep going, and we need an option for that. Establishing a new organisation like a community recovery association has some great benefits in being representative, inclusive, collaborative. The rules allow, would enable elections every 12 months, so people have an opportunity to get in or get out. And it's much more open and much more democratic. So if it works for a community, that's a great thing. Self-appointed community leaders, it's really easy that they just step forward and go, I'm the leader of this community, and people start talking to them. It's really easy to get going, but it can be destructive. It can be very destructive. Who died and made you king? I want to be, it can be really bad. And what I've observed is if the wrong leadership model's going, then really good leaders often step back and go, well, don't want to be part of that. No, I'm just look after me and my neighbours. Government sponsored, again, really easy, obvious, functional, but it often has sort of poor response to needs because it's limited by the government process, and it disables community strength and resilience. It very seldom supports the building of communities. It's just a difficult thing. Planning and managing recovery. In Strathure and Mallacoota, we pursued the 4 community environments. I think there was another one added in Mallacoota. And that comes from work in 2002. I think the 4 environments started in Victoria, enhanced by New Zealand, and then we picked it up again. A new document called Recaps, developed by Melbourne University and Red Cross and a number of other players, has 7 environments, and that's a great start if you're a disaster-affected community or supporting a community. So using the 4 or 7 environments, depending on which model you want to use, to assess impacts, to determine needs, and to plan actions. It works across the board. I've talked about a collaborative approach. It uses everyone's strengths, skills, knowledge, and resources. And to do that, ask the question, what are you as a community good at? What can you contribute? And they're good at getting together and planning things and knowing who has vulnerabilities, what the vulnerabilities are, where the resources are. Oh, the Joe Blow's got a bulldozer and the other guy's got a truckload of chainsaws. And we've got all these we've got networks. We've got 10 community organisations have each got their phone lists, and all we need to do is contact 10 people and we can reach 500 people. Communities are really good at that stuff. What are governments and NGOs good at? What can they contribute? Like I said, governments are fantastic for logistics. They're fantastic at providing resources. And I would argue that governments are really good at accepting risk. They don't like it, but they can actually absorb risk much better than local communities. Engagement of existing and emerging community leaders. So there are existing leaders in all communities. the communities know who they are. You just have to ask and say, who's the important person around town? And there are some places where one person, if they're on board, it works, and if they're not on board, it doesn't work. It's really quite important to get existing leaders on board. And there are people sitting in, waiting for things to happen to participate, to step forward, and ignoring them is poor practice as well. So allowing emerging community leaders to step forward. Continually identifying shifting needs. Stuff changes overnight. Like I said, in the first instance, in the first few days, it's water and maybe food. But that very quickly gets sorted, or people find workarounds, and it's not important a few days later. I'll talk about this a bit at the end. Establishing purpose, setting objectives, and sticking to them. So for a community-led recovery process, it's really important to establish the purpose of the community-led approach or the organisation. What is the purpose? Being really, really clear about it, setting objectives, and not getting sucked into things that aren't the responsibility of the community. In Strathure, we've been going quite well, and our local council is struggling to figure out what they do with trees. Trees were hazardous, or they were wonderful, important part of our environment, depending on who you were. And so we make a decision for them about, how do we deal with trees? What can you tell us? Can you advise us? And we almost did, and we thought, hang on, this is not our problem. This is not our job. And we backed off and said, no, it's your responsibility. You sort it. We helped them with the communications and that sort of thing, but it wasn't our job to make that decision. So not getting sucked into things, not a problem. Managing finances. Be careful what you wish for. Often in these events, there's a lot of money available, and it often drives the process rather than supports the process, which is tragic. Money is, in small communities at least, is toxic. It's you need it to do things, but unbridled money just brings out the worst in people, and it needs to be well organised and managed. If you're getting grants, they need to be acquitted eventually. So you need to do the job. You actually need to spend money, and you need to prove where it went, and keep receipts and all that sort of stuff. So finance, we just get lots of money is a is a really bad thing. Be careful what you ask for. Communicate. You can't do enough. You've got to get it right. Geez, I'm running out of time already. So some advice for community leaders. Ensure you are representing broad community. You need to know that you are doing it properly and that you are being representative, not just pushing your own barrow or meeting your own needs or your own little group or pursuing a political end or something like that. You need to be absolutely sure that you are representing a broad community and have things in place to make sure you are. Encourage and embrace collaboration. The outcomes from being collaborative and involving as many organisations and people as you can is the best. If you don't collaborate, then you miss out on a whole bunch of opportunities, and you end up competing, or it's not good. Utilise the 4 or 7 community environments model. It's just a basis for thinking and planning and doing. Be clear about your role and purpose. Don't do things that aren't your job, and spend time on setting it up and understand what your role and your purpose is. Spend the time on that to start with. Don't get sucked into issues and challenges that are not your responsibility. I always talk about that. And most importantly, I say to community folk, look after yourself, because being involved in a community recovery process is wonderful and terrible all at the same time. You learn about yourself, you learn stuff, you become great in your community, but it sucks the life out of you, and you need to manage that. I've seen community leaders who just throw themselves in completely in the end of, if you don't do it well, I reckon you've got 2 weeks before you spend some time in bed. 12 months, you can burn out, and it can do things you run on adrenaline for too long, you end up destroying relationships and your health and a whole bunch of other things. So looking after yourself, in Dr. Rob Gordon's words, find time for joy. And that's hard to do when you're in the middle of it, but taking a break, going out, seeing a movie, visiting friends, take a holiday. It doesn't feel right, but it needs to happen. And some advice for helping organisations. When I talk to particularly local government, and they ask, so how do we do this? What do we do? And I say, just go and ask, how can we help? And I say, if you do that, you're 90% there, because the answers are there. The good folk will know what's needed at the time. If you can help, your job becomes so much easier. You don't have to do all the surveys, and you don't have to do all the work. It's all there. You just have to help. Listening to and not talking at. Easy to say, but it's not the way a lot of government works. Just sitting in. I know people who are professionally engaged in disaster recovery outreach, and I reckon their job is coffee and cake. Just go and have coffee and cake with people, but it's difficult to justify. That doesn't sit in anyone's job description, but that's often what's needed: coffee and cake and listening. Governments often use a business as usual model in recovery. They don't use it in response. They don't use it in fire brigades or SES or anything else. But we seem to see it a lot in recovery, particularly in long-term recovery, and it just doesn't work. We need to be having a different model. Risk tolerance rather than risk avoidance. As I said, governments have enormous capacity to absorb risk. The worst thing that happens is a bit of reputational stuff, or it's unhappy, or we don't get elected next time. The risk to communities is tragic, and break up of families and loss of jobs, loss of life, everything. So the capacity for governments to absorb risk is much greater than communities. So they should tolerate rather than avoid. And I know that there are organisations who spend, I think, the majority of their time trying to manage and avoid risk to their organisation rather than going out helping. A transition over time from intense to subtle intervention, and I could spend another hour and a half or 5 talking about what that might mean. And any of you who have done a bit of basic psychology or sociology or something know about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I've turned this on its side, so you'll have to turn your neck a little bit because I think it works better that way. So when I say transitioning over time from intense to subtle intervention, I think governments would be, and helping organisations would be well served to be intense to start with. So in the first days, weeks after a disaster, focus on the physiological needs: air, water, shelter, sleep, clothing. Don't know about reproduction, but certainly the important life survival stuff: food, water, shelter, information, knowledge, first aid, health, are critical in the first phases, and often communities can't manage that, families can't manage that, and they rely on someone else to do it for them. So if governments are helping organisations going to get in, understand that the needs are to start with basic human survival needs. Safety needs, personal security, employment, resources, health, property. It's another layer. You can't get to there until people have got food and water and shelter. And then as you're working through there, the loving and belonging is about community and family togetherness and sharing and caring, right up to, and this hierarchy works for people, but also works for communities, actually being what they want to be and seeing the future and establishing that is way down the track. For helping organisations, understanding that being heavily involved to start with and then easing back and enabling communities to lead rather than keep going as a steamroller and building steam and building an organisation, which nearly always happens, and then finding that they have to do stuff because they're now an organisation, so they keep doing to communities rather than stepping back and enabling communities. And I tripped over something a while ago when I was still working in government, and I was working away at things, and I go, oh, this is public service. Something I think we'd forgotten about. So it's public service. How do we help our communities? Some useful sources of information. Lessons learned by Community Recovery Committees 2009. Nice little document, seldom read. You'll need to do a web search for it. I think you'll find it on a Red Cross page somewhere, but I can't give you the page because I couldn't find what it was. It's a long series of numbers and dots. People's Republic of Malakuta is currently showing Tuesday nights on ABC, but pick up the whole thing on ABC iView. A really, really good documentary, and just very nuanced in listening to and understanding different people's perspective. There's a DVD, Then the Wind Changed, which is a documentary about the first 2 years of the impact of the fires in Strathure and the recovery of the community. If you can pick up a DVD somewhere, that would be great. I don't think you can find it online. You might be able to get the DVD online. Really compulsory viewing for recovery people. Big Stories, Small Towns is a website. It's a group, an organisation, a company who spends their time going around and doing stories about particular localities. And they came to Strathure, and it was one of our projects, Telling Our Stories project. And we engaged them to do stories, video stories, 7-minute little vignettes on different topics within Strathure. Other little pictorial essays, really nice stuff if you want to get an understanding of the journey of a recovering community. Guide to Disaster Recovery Capitals recaps, that document developed by Melbourne University, Red Cross and a bunch of others. It's recoverycapitals.org.au. Australia Red Cross, as I was looking for recaps, I found Australian Red Cross page with just a bunch of resources. Go there and spend a couple of days looking around. Australian Institute of Disaster Resilience has a knowledge hub, and they have a bunch of stuff there as well, so go and find that. And as Shona said, I'm on the steering committee of Disaster Recovery Advisors and Mentors Australia, and we have currently 20 trained mentors and access to advisors who can support communities or people or practitioners to work through recovery. And our kind of sense of our purpose is so that other people don't have to go through the journey that we did. They don't have to make it up. They don't have to figure out. We can go and walk beside them and help them through and normalise their experience. And work through Australian Red Cross to access Disaster Recovery and Advisors and Mentors Australia. As Shona said, these slides are available. You can pick that up, and there's a bunch of other stuff to find as well. Shona.
Thanks, Steve. I think we've only got 2 minutes left. So
sorry.
I feel like I didn't want to interrupt you for a couple of questions because I thought it was good for you to get to this in particular, but also your great tips and that kind of thing. But I got lots of thanks in the chat. A couple of I'm wondering maybe if we just leave it there because we might, we sort of touched on some of the other questions. So I think we can leave it there. I will just say that, as Steve said, if you would like to get in touch with us about the mentoring program, I've put our Red Cross website email address in the chat for you. Feel free to drop us a line if you're interested in mentoring or want to hear more about it. Also, you'll get an email probably tomorrow. I think the automatic email kind of goes out a day after. I will pull some of these links that Steve has suggested and put them in that email. And also that email address, again, if you lose it from today, will be in the email you get tomorrow. But feel free, if you didn't have time for your final questions, feel free to drop us a line, and we can hopefully try and help you. But thanks so much for your time, Steve. It's always a pleasure listening to you. And thank you, all of you, for joining us this afternoon. Take care.
It was Jonah, before you go.
Yep.
If there was anything specific that anyone wanted to ask me, I'm happy for them to come back through you.
Sure.
Yep. And you can send them to me, and I'll communicate from then. Okay.
Yeah. So if you've got a question for Steve, drop us an email, and we will connect you, because we're good at connecting. Thanks, Steve. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks,
Take
Steve.
care.
Thanks, Shona.
Ciao.
Bye.
Bye.